They say you truly know someone only when the mask slips. But what if the mask was never off to begin with? What if the person sleeping next to you, loving you, toasting milestones with you, was quietly planning your destruction all along, 10 years of marriage? That's how long Charlotte Miller had loved David, 10 years of candlelit anniversaries, whispered dreams, and carefully curated success. They were the couple everyone in Chicago admired. She, the fierce and brilliant founder of Miller Consulting, a powerhouse that had advised Fortune 500s, he, the charming, poised investor with a reputation as solid as his tailored suits. Together, they built a life that sparkled, downtown condo. Summer weekends in Napa, matching luxury watches engraved with "Always Us" from the outside, perfect. But perfection has a sound when it begins to crack. It's silent, subtle, a shift in how long it takes for him to answer your question. A glance that lingers too long on his phone. A smile that stops at his mouth but never quite reaches the eyes. That night, the pinnacle shimmered in a golden haze. The city's tallest restaurant, perched high above the skyline, was their place. A ritual, every anniversary, they'd come here. Order the same bottle of Cabernet, toast the same dreams. Charlotte had slipped into a navy silk dress he once said made her look like royalty. David wore the suit she'd gifted him last Christmas, sharply cut, immaculate. The stage was set. But the script had changed. He was off. There was something hollow. He said the right things, happy anniversary, babe, but it was like hearing a familiar song played just slightly off-key. She saw the way his fingers drummed the table, how he silenced his buzzing phone without even checking who it was. His eyes flicked around the room more than they looked at her. There was distance in them, not the kind born of a bad day. No, this was different. It felt like fear or guilt. Charlotte tried to brush it off. She smiled, clinked her glass, took a sip of the wine that should have tasted like velvet but settled like ice in her chest. This was the man who used to stay up all night helping her prepare for investor pitches. The man who framed her first client contract and hung it in their office. The man who told her once, "We rise together or not at all, so why now?" Did he feel like a stranger? The waiter clearing a nearby table wore her hair in a neat braid. A young woman, no older than 25, Charlotte barely registered her until she reappeared moments later in the restroom. Alone, face pale, eyes wide, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, ma'am," she said, wringing her hands, "but I saw your husband. He put something in your wine." It didn't land at first. Charlotte blinked, frozen. "I'm sorry, what?" The girl her name tag said. Sophie nodded quickly, urgent now. "I didn't know what to do. I was clearing the table near yours, and I saw him take something from his jacket. He looked around, then stirred your glass while you were gone. I don't know what it was, but it didn't look right. Please, just be careful." In that moment, Charlotte felt time split. Half of her wanted to laugh. This couldn't be real. Her husband David. The man who held her hand through her mother's funeral. Who brought her soup when she had the flu, poison her. But the other half. The part that had been silently clocking his restless energy, his sudden absences, the coded phone calls, that half already knew. This wasn't out of nowhere. This was the next step in something far darker than she dared to imagine. She returned to the table, mask fixed, pulse racing. To wine glasses sat like landmines, and that's when she made a decision. Without hesitating, she swapped the glasses, his for hers. Hers for his, masked behind a casual gesture. If Sophie was wrong, no harm done. If Sophie was right. David lifted the glass, her glass, and drank deeply. And then, everything began to unravel. Before I go any further, I need to pause. If this story rattled something inside you even just a little, then you know how easily love can be weaponized. How silence, charm, and familiarity can mask malice. Charlotte didn't just escape a toxic marriage, she narrowly avoided death. And the truth is, stories like hers, they're not rare, they're just rarely told. So if you're invested in seeing where this goes, how she exposes the truth, takes back her power, and confronts not just David, but the system that let him get that far, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Because what comes next isn't just a plot twist. It's a masterclass in survival. justice, and rebirth. We share real, powerful, sometimes uncomfortable stories about love, betrayal, and human resilience. If this resonated with you even 1%, your support means the world. And it helps keep these voices heard. Now before you go, let me leave you with a question, a small test of perspective. If you were Charlotte and a stranger told you your partner had just tried to poison you, would you confront him immediately, demand the truth? Stay calm, gather proof, and act only when you're certain. Drop your answer or be in the comments below. I read every one. And trust me, the way you answer says a lot more than you think. They say betrayal doesn't happen in an instant. It builds like a slow, invisible leak in the foundation of everything you thought was solid. That's what Charlotte Miller began to understand in the quiet hours after the ambulance took her husband away. David had collapsed, right there at the pinnacle, moments after sipping the wine she'd secretly swapped. The shock on his face, the sudden paleness, the disorientation, it all played in a loop in her mind as she sat alone in the sterile waiting room of Chicago General. Her navy silk dress, once elegant and celebratory, was now wrinkled and stained with a wine that, as it turned out, had carried more than just notes of cherry and oak. Her hands trembled not from fear anymore, but from something colder, recognition. What had once seemed absurd, the idea that her husband of 10 years could harm her, was now no longer a question. It was a fact, and the truth, when it comes, doesn't knock. It breaks the door down. A doctor finally emerged with guarded eyes and clipped words. Diazepam, in a dangerously concentrated dose. Not over the counter, not accidental. Enough to sedate an adult into unconsciousness or worse. And David, he had ingested it, not her. I switched the glasses, Charlotte admitted, barely above a whisper. Someone warned me, a waitress. She saw him put something in my wine. It was a moment that shifted everything, not just her understanding of the night, but her entire marriage. Because if this was intentional and every sign pointed to yes, then David hadn't just lied, he'd plotted. And he hadn't just betrayed her, he'd tried to erase her. Soon after, Charlotte received a call. The voice on the other end was rough, familiar, and carried a weight of urgency. Charlotte, it's Mark Ellison. We need to talk about David. Mark, David's former business partner, the man David used to speak of with that quiet, smug superiority like he was a relic from a chapter long closed. She hadn't heard Mark's name in years. Not since the firm David and Mark built together, Ellison and Miller Realty, suddenly became just Miller Capital. But the tone in his voice wasn't bitter, it was urgent, personal. They met at a quiet coffee shop off Fifth. Mark looked older than she remembered, leaner, worn, but his eyes were sharp, and the manila folder on the table between them spoke of nights spent digging through the rot David had left behind. I don't think you know the whole picture, he said gently, pushing the folder toward her. But you need to. Charlotte opened it. What she saw inside shattered whatever was left of the illusion she'd been clinging to. Bank statements, transfers to offshore accounts. Signed documents where her name had been forged. Medical reports from a psychiatrist claiming she showed early signs of cognitive decline. Letters prepared to declare her legally unfit to manage her own affairs. A blueprint, quiet, calculated, cruel. David hadn't just tried to drug her, he had spent months laying the groundwork to take over her life, her company, her assets, her independence. The sedative was simply the final step. Mark leaned forward, voice low. He was drowning, Charlotte. His firm's been bleeding for years, bad investments, shady trades. He's been dodging creditors with one hand while forging documents with the other. Your name, your firm was his way out. He needed control of everything, and this, he tapped the psychiatric report, this was how he planned to get it. Charlotte stared at the papers, bile rising in her throat. She thought of the times he'd insisted on managing their shared accounts, of how he'd casually dismissed her questions about paperwork, estate planning, business restructuring. She thought of his charm, his laughter, the way he'd say, "Don't worry, I've got us covered." He hadn't been covering them, he'd been covering his tracks. What do you do when you realize someone's been studying your every move, not to love you better but to dismantle you more efficiently? She left the coffee shop with the folder clutched to her chest like a lifeline or a balm. Every page inside was a piece of the man she'd once trusted more than herself, and now it would become evidence. Later that afternoon, she handed the folder to her lawyer. Diane Kessler, woman Charlotte had known and trusted since her firm's earliest days. Diane read through the documents in stunned silence, her silver hair pulled back, her fingers tightening around each page. "This is monstrous," she finally said. "He's filed preliminary guardianship claims. If he'd succeeded, Charlotte, he would have had power of attorney. He could have frozen your firm, liquidated your accounts. You would have been silenced legally, financially, medically, everything." The air left the room. Charlotte felt like she was breathing underwater. It was too much, too fast, but it was real. "We're filing for divorce today," Diane said. "Restraining order, asset protection, full cooperation with law enforcement. You're not just a target, you're the victim of attempted murder. And a massive financial crime. Victim." The word made Charlotte flinch, not because it wasn't true, but because it made it real. As the days blurred into legal filings, statements, and depositions, Charlotte barely slept. But in the rare moments of quiet, she thought of Sophie, the young waitress with the braid who had spoken up, who had seen something and said something, even though it could have cost her job, her safety. Sophie didn't know Charlotte. She had nothing to gain. But she saw a woman in danger and chose to act. That decision saved Charlotte's life. What do we call that kind of courage? Charlotte didn't know yet. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity now. David hadn't just tried to kill her body, he had tried to erase her entirely. Replace her with a version he could control. It wasn't just betrayal. It was annihilation, disguised in a tailored suit and a familiar smile. And she had looked into the abyss and said no. The unraveling had begun. And David, whether he knew it yet or not, was about to lose everything. Because Charlotte was done being afraid and now she was going to fight. There is something haunting about sitting across from the man who once whispered forever into your ear while he stands accused of trying to end your life. The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature, but in tone. A place of measured voices, sharp glances, and truths laid bare. For Charlotte Miller, it felt like stepping into a version of her own funeral, except she was very much alive, and the man who wanted otherwise was just a few feet away. David sat at the defense table in a wrinkled grey suit, nothing like the crisp, confident man she had once known. His jaw clenched, eyes sunken, shoulders hunched like a boxer who knew the knockout was coming. He didn't look at her, not once. The courtroom was packed. Journalists with notepads, whispers from gallery spectators, even a few of her own colleagues sat with wide, unreadable eyes. The headline had made the rounds: prominent investor David Miller accused of attempted murder and fraud. But to Charlotte, this wasn't about headlines or shock value. This was the moment she reclaimed her truth. The prosecution began with a quiet but firm tone. Assistant District Attorney Vargas laid out the narrative with surgical precision. He projected images, presented documents, and played security footage from the pinnacle that captured David's sleight of hand the moment he slipped a substance into Charlotte's wine while glancing over his shoulder. The courtroom gasped as the footage froze on his hand hovering over the glass. But the real devastation came not from video or paper, but from the weight of intent. This was not a moment of passion, it was premeditated, Vargas said, pacing slowly. Mr. Miller forged psychiatric reports to have his wife declared legally incompetent. He attempted to transfer her assets, he planted a sedative in her drink. And when she survived, only then did the lies begin to unravel. Charlotte sat motionless, her spine straight, her expression calm. But inside, every word sliced through her. Because each point, each exhibit, wasn't just evidence, it was a memory of misplaced trust, of nights spent believing in someone who had weaponized her love against her. Her name was called, the courtroom shifted. She stood, walked to the witness stand, and placed her hand on the Bible, and as she sat down, facing 12 strangers and a man she once shared a bed with, she didn't tremble. She spoke clear, measured, unwavering. She recounted the details of that night, Sophie's warning, the decision to switch glasses, the moment David collapsed. Then she told the harder truths of the fake reports, the forged signatures, the whispers of desperation that she had once dismissed as stress or pride. And finally, she spoke of betrayal. He didn't just lie to me, she said, her voice low but resonant. He planned to erase me, my name, my will, my voice. He wanted control, not partnership. And the moment I became inconvenient, he tried to silence me for good. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Even David's lawyer Tom Carver, the same smug man Charlotte remembered from that dinner party 6 months ago, seemed to shrink in his seat. Then Sophie took the stand. Her braid was gone, replaced with a neat bun, but her voice held the same courage it had that night. She told the jury what she saw, how David looked around before dropping something into the wine, how she debated with herself for precious seconds before following Charlotte to the restroom, how she didn't think, she just knew it was wrong. I couldn't live with myself if I said nothing, Sophie said, glancing briefly at Charlotte. It didn't matter who she was, I just saw someone who needed to know the truth. That was the moment Charlotte finally felt her throat tighten. Sophie didn't owe her anything. She wasn't family, wasn't a friend. But she was the kind of person who acted not because she had to but because it was right. And that kind of bravery, in a world often too quiet, is a rare and sacred thing. David's defense was weak. Tom Carver tried to argue that the wine incident was a misunderstanding, that David had mixed his vitamins and must have dropped one by mistake, that the medical reports were suggested evaluations for Charlotte's own good, that the bank transfers were reallocations, but it was too late. The documents from Mark Ellison, David's former partner, exposed the financial hemorrhaging, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. The psychiatric reports were proven to be forgeries, signed by a doctor who hadn't seen Charlotte in years, bribed and now under investigation himself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty, the foreperson said, voice clear, unshaking. On all counts: attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, a woman with grey streaks in her tightly pinned bun, delivered the sentence without flinching. 15 years, no possibility of parole. The gavel fell, a sound like thunder. And David finally looked at her, not with anger, not even regret, but with the hollow resignation of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Charlotte didn't look away. As he was led out in cuffs, shoulders stooped, she stood still. Diane touched her arm gently, grounding her. Around them, reporters began to stir, pens flying, cameras ready, but Charlotte wasn't thinking of them. She was thinking of the first time she met David, when she was 22 and foolishly dazzled by his confidence. She thought of their wedding, the vows he made, the night they signed the lease to their first apartment, the dinner when he toasted her first $1 million deal. She thought of the woman she had been, full of belief, of love, of dangerous hope. And then she thought of Sophie, of Diane, of Mark, of every piece of truth that pulled her back from the edge. David hadn't just failed to destroy her, he had revealed her strength. She walked out of that courtroom not as a woman shattered by betrayal, but as one forged by it. The justice system had spoken. She had found her own verdict long before the jury did. And it was this: I survived, and that is the only truth that mattered now. For reclaiming her life, fears a strange kind of silence that settles in after survival. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels earned. For Charlotte Miller, that silence arrived not in a courtroom or a hospital hallway, but in a small cottage on the edge of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, far from the glinting skyline of Chicago, far from courtrooms and reporters, far from the scent of David's cologne that once clung to her condo walls like a ghost. The cottage was modest, white shutters, wildflowers that climbed without permission, and a porch swing that creaked when the wind whispered through the trees. It wasn't a retreat, it was a reclamation. The first real space that belonged to her, alone, without pretense, without performance. After the verdict, Charlotte had done what most people expected. She filed for divorce, froze all joint assets, restructured her firm's ownership to shield it from the remnants of David's legal reach. But then she did something no one expected. She left, not in fear, but in exhaustion. A soul-deep tiredness that couldn't be fixed with sleep or therapy appointments. She didn't want to be strong anymore, she wanted to be still. The boxes from her condo arrived in a moving van 1 week after the final hearing. Most of the designer furniture had been sold. She kept the books, the sketchpads she hadn't opened in years, a few frames with photos she hadn't yet decided whether to keep or burn. And the navy silk dress, the one from the night everything changed, she hung it in the back of a closet. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder, a life nearly lost. A woman almost erased, but not quite. The first week at the cottage, Charlotte didn't open her laptop once. Her firm was running fine without her. Her CFO, a brilliant, no-nonsense woman named Lisa, had taken the reins and assured her, "We've got it. You take the time you need." And for once, Charlotte believed someone when they said those words. She spent her mornings walking barefoot through dew-soaked grass, her afternoons painting with no agenda, no clients, no strategy, just color and silence. And in the evenings, she sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the sun sink behind the trees, not waiting for anyone to come home. But one thought returned, over and over: Sophie. She hadn't spoken to her since the trial. There hadn't been time. Legal chaos had taken over, followed by the slow, aching process of putting her life back together. But Sophie had changed everything. A stranger who had no reason to care, and yet had chosen to act. Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was she, really? What life had she returned to after that night? Was she okay? Did she know what she had done, not just in saving Charlotte's life, but in restoring her belief in humanity when everything around her had collapsed? One morning, Charlotte opened her laptop for the first time in weeks and searched Sophie Collins, Chicago. The results were ordinary. A sparse LinkedIn profile, current job, server at the Pinnacle. Part-time student at City College, no photo, no details. It made her smile in a strange, grateful way. Sophie didn't want attention, she didn't need it. She just did what she believed was right. Still, Charlotte drafted a message: "Sophie, this is Charlotte Miller. I've been meaning to reach out for a long time. I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You didn't just save me, you gave me my life back. If you're open to it, I'd love to meet you. No pressure, coffee's on me." She hit send and stared at the screen, unsure what she hoped for. An answer came the next morning: "Hi Charlotte, I'm glad you're okay. Coffee sounds nice. Saturday, 11 a.m. Riverside Cafe." It was the first plan she'd made in months that felt like it mattered. When Charlotte arrived at the cafe that Saturday, the riverside breeze carried the scent of wet grass and espresso. Sophie was already there, wearing jeans and a simple grey sweater, her hair loose this time, no braid. She looked young, grounded, and remarkably at peace. "Hi," Charlotte said, sitting across from her. "Hi," Sophie smiled. "You look different, lighter." Charlotte asked freer. They talked about the trial, about the chaos, but also about life. Charlotte offered her a job, a scholarship, financial support, anything she wanted. Sophie shook her head with a soft laugh. "That's kind of you, but I'm okay. I work part-time. I study at night. My boyfriend fixes trucks. We've got a dog named Rusty. My grandmother lives 2 blocks away. It's simple, but it's mine." Charlotte sat in quiet awe of that. In her world, ambition had always been the currency of worth. But here was a woman who had chosen presence over prestige, simplicity over spectacle. And she wasn't lacking anything. "Why did you help me?" Charlotte asked gently. "That night, you could have said nothing." Sophie's answer was so simple, it almost hurt, because it was wrong. "And you looked like someone who hadn't been told the truth in a long time." Charlotte blinked. That truth landed heavier than any courtroom verdict. They sat a while longer, sipping their coffees, exchanging stories that had nothing to do with betrayal or legal terms, just life. And as they parted ways with a warm hug and promises to stay in touch, Charlotte felt something shift again, not a collapse this time, but a settling. Like the ground beneath her was finally solid. That evening, back at the cottage, she stood on the porch and watched the sky shift from lavender to indigo. The wind curled through the pines, and for the first time in a long time, she felt no weight on her chest. No waiting for the next blow, no fear of the quiet. This was what healing looked like, not loud, not cinematic, just ordinary moments done with intention. A conversation, a walk, a truth finally spoken. Reclaiming her life wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. And in that quiet, Charlotte finally understood. She hadn't lost everything, she had lost what never truly loved her. What never truly saw her, and now finally she could begin. There comes a point, after the chaos quiets and the papers are signed, when the question is no longer what happened to me, but who do I want to become now? For Charlotte Miller, that moment arrived not with fireworks or applause, but with a breath quiet, deliberate, and wholly her own. The cottage had become a sacred space, a place where time didn't demand anything of her, where healing wasn't measured in milestones or productivity, but in presence. She woke up each morning to the sound of birdsong and the rustling of trees, brewed her coffee slowly, and painted whatever came to mind. Some days it was just colours, other days it was landscapes or fragments of memory. But it was hers, and that was enough. Her firm continued to operate smoothly under the new leadership. She remained a silent partner, no longer attached to the title of CEO. For years, her identity had been fused with achievement. Every deal closed, every accolade, every strategic win. But now, she found herself uninterested in metrics or markets. Success, she realized, wasn't a finish line, it was peace. And yet, even peace carries its own kind of restlessness. A few months after reconnecting with Sophie, after the interviews ended and the headlines faded, Charlotte began to feel a pull. Not back to the boardroom, but forward to something undefined, something that asked more of her than safety. She found herself standing by the lake one evening, toes in the cold water, watching the sun melt behind the trees. A question rose in her, quiet but firm. What would it mean to live without fear, without duty, without the past pulling at her heels? She packed lightly. A backpack, her sketchpad, a few clothes. She sold the cottage, not with sadness, but with reverence. It had given her what she needed, a cocoon for transformation, but she wasn't meant to stay in one place. Not yet. Charlotte set out west, no itinerary, no fixed destination. She moved through quiet towns and open roads like a woman being rewritten. She hitchhiked across Arizona with a retired teacher who made sculptures out of scrap metal. She spent 3 weeks in Santa Fe painting desert skies and helping an elderly woman repaint her porch. She laughed more than she had in years, deep, belly laughter that shook something loose inside her. She stayed in hostels, sometimes on couches of people she barely knew, and found joy in conversations over campfires and gas station coffee. She traded luxury for freedom, perfection for authenticity. Her sketchbook began to fill not just with images, but with stories. Stories of people who'd been broken and rebuilt, of women who'd left bad marriages, teenagers who'd run from painful homes, men who'd lost everything and still got up each morning to feed the stray cats on their street. Charlotte listened, she observed, and slowly, she began to understand the shape of her own becoming. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was alive. Love found her in the least expected way, not as a grand, sweeping romance, but as a steady presence. A quiet man named Eli, a mechanic with gentle eyes and a kind laugh, who fixed trucks by day and played old jazz records at night. He never asked about her past until she was ready to share it, and when she did, he didn't flinch. He just held her hand, the kind of hand that said, "You're safe now." But even with Eli, Charlotte didn't abandon herself. She'd spent too many years being what someone else needed. Now, she only moved forward if it didn't cost her peace, and Eli understood that. One evening, sitting on the hood of a truck under the stars, Eli turned to her and asked, "If you could go back and undo everything, would you?" Charlotte didn't answer right away. She looked up at the sky, the same sky that had hung above her during court dates and lonely nights, above the cottage porch and the city skyline. And she said, "No, because I would have never found this version of me, the one who isn't afraid to start over." She kept traveling, not to escape, but to expand. Each new place etched something into her spirit. A mountain hike in Oregon taught her to trust her breath again. A quiet cabin in Montana reminded her how to be alone without being lonely. A street artist in Seattle told her, "Pain is just the body's way of honoring where we've been." Eventually, she published a book, a collection of sketches and essays titled After the Fall. It wasn't a memoir of David or the trial. It was about reclaiming selfhood, about joy and wilderness, and the art of unlearning. Readers wrote to her from around the country. Some told her they finally found the courage to leave a toxic marriage. Others simply thanked her for putting language to what they had long felt but never spoken. But Charlotte didn't write to be applauded. She wrote to make sense of what it meant to become someone new after the old life died. One spring morning, while refilling her coffee at a roadside diner in Wyoming, she looked up and caught her own reflection in the window. Her hair had grown longer, her skin bore the softness of someone no longer fighting the world. And her eyes no longer searching, no longer guarded, were steady. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time in her life, everything was real. Her past no longer defined her, it had refined her. And now, as the road stretched ahead, wide and unwritten, Charlotte Miller walked it not as a woman recovering from ruin, but as one who had risen from it, whole, unapologetic, and utterly free. In the end, Charlotte's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about awakening. It's about what happens when everything you thought was safe turns against you and somehow you still rise. Her journey began in comfort, status, and certainty. She had love, or at least the version of it she had been sold. She had power, prestige, and a life that many admired. But beneath the polish was something darker, a silence too long endured, a loyalty too one-sided, a love that had become control in disguise. When the mask slipped and the truth emerged, it didn't just shatter her illusions. It shattered the identity built on those illusions. And that kind of break isn't something you simply move on from. You move through it slowly, painfully, deliberately. Piece by piece, Charlotte didn't just rebuild her life, she redefined what it meant to be alive. She stepped away from the expectations, from the applause, from the carefully curated version of herself that had been built for others. And in doing so, she found something more precious than anything she'd ever owned, her own voice. This story is a reminder that healing is not linear. It doesn't always look brave, it doesn't always look strong. Sometimes, healing is sitting on a porch and doing nothing but breathing. Sometimes it's quitting the job that once defined you. Sometimes it's walking away from the person you thought you couldn't live without because staying would cost you everything that truly matters. Charlotte teaches us that starting over doesn't mean starting from nothing. It means starting from wisdom, from truth, from scars that no longer bleed, but that remind us we lived, that we endured, that we survived. So what's the deeper lesson here? The lesson is this: you are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become next. No matter how broken your past may seem, no matter how much time you feel you've lost or how deep the betrayal went, you still get to choose what happens now. You can choose peace, you can choose freedom. You can choose yourself. How do you apply this to your life today? Start by asking yourself, am I living the life I chose or the one I settled for? Listen to your discomfort. Often, it's your soul's alarm system. Surround yourself with people who tell you the truth, even when it's hard, people like Sophie in the story. Protect your voice, your time, your energy like it's sacred. Because it is, and above all, don't be afraid to begin again. Whether it's in your career, your relationships, or your sense of self, there is no shame in rebuilding. There is only courage. Charlotte's story may be fictional, but the emotions are very real for many of us. If her journey sparked something in you, if you've ever felt trapped, betrayed, silenced, or just tired, know that you're not alone. And more importantly, know that you are allowed to change everything, even if that means walking away from what others still believe is perfect. Now, I'd love to hear from you. If you had to choose one word to describe the kind of life you truly want, what would it be? Peaceful, be purposeful. Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insight might inspire someone else who's still searching for clarity. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. And if you'd like to support the work I'm doing, especially as someone older now, trying to use what time I have left to share stories that heal and empower, your donation, no matter how small, would be deeply appreciated. It gives me the strength and resources to keep producing meaningful content that speaks to the soul. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. This story may end here, but your next chapter is just beginning.